Ah, the House of Lords. You know, it sounds old, it definitely looks old, and for a lot of us, it's one of the weirdest parts of the whole UK political system. We've all heard the jokes, but what does it actually do? Okay, let's dive in and really try to figure out what's going on in there.
Because, let's be honest, when you look at it, it is a very odd arrangement. You've got around 800 people, most of whom we didn't elect, sitting in Parliament and having a say on our laws. So it's really no surprise that when we talk about it, the whole conversation kind of boils down to a few familiar jabs.
You've probably heard this one, right? That the Lords is just a fancy retirement home. You know, a place for politicians to go when they're done, just collecting a daily allowance for dozing off on those famous red benches.
Or how about this one, which really gets to the heart of it all? They're unelected. We, the public, didn't put them there. So how on earth can it be right that they have any say at all in the laws that run our lives? That's a point that feels pretty hard to argue with.
And then, of course, there's the classic criticism that they're just an obstacle. They exist purely to put the brakes on a government that was actually elected. Now look, some of these ideas, they do have a little bit of truth to them, but they absolutely do not tell the whole story.
So that brings us right to the big question for this explainer. What is the House of Lords actually for? I don't mean in some dusty constitutional textbook, I mean in practice. Day to day, what job does it really do?
To get our heads around its practical role, I found a simple analogy to be really helpful. Let's try thinking of the House of Lords not as a rival to the House of Commons, but more like its grandparent.
Yeah, just like this. So on one side you have the House of Commons, that's the adult child. It's got the job, it runs the House, controls the money, and it makes the final call. But on the other side, you've got the House of Lords, the grandparent. It doesn't have the final say, but it advises, it warns, and crucially, it's always there to ask that one important question. Are you sure about that?
It's exactly the kind of question a grandparent would ask, isn't it? They can't just overrule their grown-up kid, but they can offer some wisdom, a bit of experience, and a totally different perspective. They can spot potential problems that might have been missed when everyone was in a rush.
And this is really the key. Most of the time, the adult child, the Commons, is going to do what it was going to do anyway. But sometimes, just often enough for it to really matter, that grandparent's voice makes them stop, rethink, and maybe adjust something they hadn't properly considered.
Okay, so the grandparent analogy is a pretty useful way to think about it. But let's move from the metaphor to the actual mechanics. What does the House of Lords really do day in and day out?
Well, its main job can be summed up in one word: scrutiny. It's all about putting new laws under a microscope. The Lords is a revising chamber. Its members, who are often genuine experts in things like law, science, or business, go through bills line by line. They're the ones asking the super detailed, technical, and sometimes awkward questions, and they propose changes that force the government to really explain itself.
And this clears up a big misunderstanding. When the Lords holds up a new law, it's really easy to see it as them just trying to block things. But usually, that delay is just a side effect. The real point, the actual goal, is to do a proper, thorough review. Which brings us to this idea called friction by design. It sounds a bit technical, but it's simple. If you want to properly check complex new laws, it's just going to take time. That slowing down effect isn't a bug in the system, it's a built-in feature. It's supposed to be there to make the final law better.
Okay, but that brings up the obvious question, right? If the House of Commons gets the final say anyway, can't the government just ignore the Lords and do whatever it wants?
You know, is there some big red button on the Prime Minister's desk that says ignore the Lords? Well, the answer is kinda yes and no. It's a little more complicated than that.
See, to overrule the Lords, the government can't just shrug and move on. They have to go through a very public song and dance. First, they actually have to listen to the feedback. Then, if they still don't agree, they have to say so publicly. After that, they have to physically bring the law back to the Commons. And finally, they have to stand up and publicly own the decision to overrule the experts. Each step is designed to make it a very deliberate, very visible choice.
And that's the whole point. The House of Lords can't force the government to change its mind. But what it can do is force the government to make ignoring good advice a deliberate, visible, and public choice. And trust me, that is very different from being powerless.
All right, so let's pull all this together. We've seen that the House of Lords does a pretty useful job of reviewing and scrutinizing laws. But that doesn't change the fact that the whole thing is, well, just plain weird.
Here it is. This is the central contradiction that makes so many of us feel a bit uneasy.
We have an unelected group of people who we can't vote out that still manages to shape our laws, influence what happens, and even force elected governments to go back to the drawing board.
So why is it like this? Well, the simple answer is that nobody ever really designed it this way. It just happened. It accumulated powers, it lost others, it was bent and shaped by centuries of political compromises, but it never got a full factory reset. It's a product of history, not a blueprint.
And that's why this is the perfect way to think about the modern House of Lords. It's a messy, complicated, cobbled-together machine that somehow, against all odds, actually does something useful at the end. It does the vital work of checking our laws, but in a way so bizarre that honestly, nobody would ever design it like this today if they were starting from scratch.
Which leaves us here. We now have a better idea of what the Lords actually does. But that just opens up even bigger questions, doesn't it? Like, why do we even have this thing? What was it supposed to do originally? And is this still the right way to get that job done today? I guess those are questions we'll have to chew on next time.